It was June, and we were camping near Asheville, North Carolina, along the Appalachian Trail. My boyfriend, our dog, and I had just finished a day of kayaking on the river that ran by our campsite, which was only about 10 feet from the trail itself. After a somewhat stressful day on the water, we were looking forward to relaxing. We were running low on weed, so we ate some edibles to unwind, because, well, we're stoners. My boyfriend was dozing in his hammock while I was laying on a towel by the river, soaking in the calm before dinner. Out of nowhere, this guy appeared, rambling about his trash. At first, I was confused, but I noticed he was wearing a backpack and a shirt with the Appalachian Trail logo. It clicked that he was a long-distance hiker and just wanted us to dispose of his garbage. A reasonable request, but we were only a 5-minute walk from a place with a dumpster and basic amenities. I told him he could easily take care of it himself, but then he pulled out a big bag of weed and offered me some in exchange for throwing out his trash. I was a bit taken aback, but free weed, sure, why not? He handed me a few nugs and tossed his trash into our bag. We started some small talk, the usual stuff, asking if he was through hiking and how long he'd been on the trail. He mentioned he'd been at it for a few months and then asked if he could hang out and drink a beer with us. I figured he just needed some human interaction, so I said yes. He seemed normal enough at first, though I did get the sense that he thought I was alone until my boyfriend poked his head out of the hammock. The hiker looked a bit surprised when he saw him, which made me think he was hoping to chat me up or something. No big deal, I thought, just a harmless misunderstanding. The guy kept assuring us he wasn't one of those creepy people, which was, honestly, a weird thing to say. Still, I tried to be friendly and asked him about his hiking stories. He was answering normally at first, so I didn't think too much of it. Eventually, we all decided to smoke some of the weed he gave us, offering him some too since it was his in the first place. After a few hits, though, things took a strange turn. He started talking, but his voice got so quiet we could barely hear him. He was mumbling to himself, mostly staring at the river but occasionally looking at us like we were part of his conversation. I tried to respond a few times, but honestly, I had no clue what he was talking about. It was weird, unsettling even, but we chalked it up to him being too high. He downed 3 beers and smoked 2 cigarettes while all of this was happening, and the vibe got progressively weirder. At some point, he started yelling at Siri on his phone, calling her all sorts of names. Then, completely out of the blue, he asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I seem like a serial killer? My boyfriend and I exchanged nervous looks. We laughed it off, both of us awkwardly saying, "Oh, 1. Definitely a 1, like we were playing along with a joke, but deep down, we were seriously creeped out. After that, I made it clear, at least to myself, that he was no longer welcome. We retreated to the hammock together, making it obvious we were done engaging with him. He claimed he was going to smoke 1 more cigarette and then leave. But that cigarette felt like the longest one ever. We watched it burn down, praying he would just leave already. Finally, he stood up, gathered his stuff, and walked off, but it was nearly dark, and we knew he wouldn't go far before setting up camp. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling that he might come back. We heard people passing by on the trail, some of whom we'd seen earlier, including a couple who seemed like they were on something. Every noise made us jump, and we even made a plan: if the hiker returned, we'd grab the dog and float downriver to the boat ramp. Thankfully, he didn't come back, and we never saw him again. But the whole experience left us on edge. I grew up in the southern Appalachians, specifically in western North Carolina, about 30 minutes from Asheville. The hills and hollows of the Appalachian Mountains are part of one of the world's oldest ranges, with some rock formations dating back over 1 billion years, long before terrestrial animals roamed the earth. As is common with ancient places, there are unexplainable phenomena, some harmless, others more sinister. For instance, the Brown Mountain Lights. I've never felt uneasy witnessing them from Wiseman's view. They aren't good or bad, they simply exist. On the lighter side, walking through an abandoned church near my parents' land can feel like bathing in warm, positive energy, much like the first gentle sunshine of summer. But this tale isn't about one of those peaceful anomalies. It's about something truly dark. About 10 years ago, I was attending night school at AB Tech, studying automotive mechanics. I'd head to class around 2 p.m. after my part-time job and return home around 10:30 p.m. Most nights, I'd drive the same route in my 1973 Dodge W200 truck, but sometimes I'd take the back roads if I wanted a change. One Thursday evening, however, I stuck to the interstate, eager to get home and rest, as I had plans to go hiking early the next day. But as I exited the highway, a strange feeling crept over me, an eerie stillness, and not a single sound from the animals I usually heard through my rolled-down windows. Approaching a gas station near my parents' place, I noticed it was completely dark. It was a 24-hour stop, always lit up, but I figured the power might be out. Still, something felt off. As I carefully drove along, I glanced up at the sky. The night was unusually void of stars, which was strange for this part of Appalachia. On clear nights, you can see the Milky Way, but tonight the sky was nearly blank. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights illuminated a decaying barn I always passed. In that moment, a large, sickly dog suddenly darted in front of my truck, barely 10 feet away. My truck didn't stop well, but I slammed on the brakes, causing my tires to screech. I thought I'd hit someone's pet and dreaded the idea of telling the owner. The smell of burning rubber filled the air, followed by the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh, though I dismissed it as roadkill. I reversed to see the damage, expecting to find the injured dog. But instead, lit by the dim glow of my reverse lights, I saw the dog, only it wasn't a dog anymore. It had stood up on its hind legs like a man, towering over 10 feet tall. My truck's front end stands about 5 feet high, and on all fours, the creature's shoulders had been that tall. Now, it was much larger. Its skin hung loose, like it didn't quite fit, with patches of matted fur and filth clinging to its body. Its right arm seemed longer than the left, both hanging unnaturally low. When it turned its head toward me, I realized this was no ordinary animal. Its face had human-like features, but the edges of its face shifted, like something microscopic moving beneath the surface. There were no eyes, just empty sockets. The skin on its face was gray and lifeless, and its mouth was filled with too many jagged teeth, seemingly crammed in, searching for a way out. The creature stared right through me, as if it could see into my very soul. It felt like time stood still, though only a few seconds passed. A light flickered on in a nearby house, snapping the creature's attention away from me. It bolted into the woods, moving like a man, but faster than any human should be able to. I floored my truck and raced home, too terrified to tell anyone what I had seen. Instead, I loaded every gun I owned and locked all the doors. That night, even my parents' dogs, usually noisy at any disturbance, were completely silent. For days, I couldn't shake the experience. It wasn't until 6 years later, after meeting my wife, that I encountered something similar. Her family lived just a few miles from my parents. One evening, after a movie, we went to check on her Great Pyrenees, which had been quarantined after a run-in with a raccoon. As we walked back from the kennel, I got that same uneasy feeling, and then the smell of decay hit me. My wife joked that it was me, but I knew better. I felt it again, the same dread from that night years ago. As we neared the house, we heard barking. The sound was identical to the Pyrenees, but it couldn't have been him, as he was right next to us. He sensed it too, turning and growling toward the woods. When we finally made it to safety, I caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the light, standing still before darting off into the darkness. The next day, my wife's sister, a practitioner of old Appalachian folk magic, came to bless the property. The dog kennel was destroyed, the concrete pad cracked, the chain-link fence torn apart. The same rotting stench lingered in the air. After blessing the property, she warned us never to go into the woods after dark. Years later, after moving to Delaware with my wife, I thought I had left that nightmare behind. But last night, while playing outside with my dogs, the stench returned. My American bulldog took off toward the woods, growling in a way I'd never heard before. I rushed him back to the house, locking the doors and loading my guns. Outside, the bushes and trees swayed as if something had just passed through them. I haven't slept since, and I won't go near the woods after dark, not until whatever this is leaves me alone for good. I grew up in West Virginia but moved around between the Appalachian region and the Midwest as a kid. Between the ages of 10 and 13, I lived in a small town called Rue, Kentucky, tucked into the foothills of one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. I lived with my dad and grandma in a little cul-de-sac nestled between those hills. Our family had the neighborhood pretty much to ourselves, no one else lived on either side of us, and there was nothing but woods behind and across from us. When I first moved in, my grandma gave me a list of rules to follow. At the time, I figured they were just her version of country-style, stranger danger, warnings. She'd say things like, don't mess with wild animals, never go into the woods by yourself, and, more strangely, if you hear your name being called, don't answer it, and, if you see someone you know in the woods, no you didn't, just come home. The strange event I'm about to tell you about happened one August when I was 11. My dad and I had mowed a path through the tall grass and blackberry bushes beside our double-wide trailer. We often camped there because it was close enough to check on my grandma but far enough out that it still felt like we were roughing it. When you're in the woods, sounds are magnified, bugs, animals, wind, and even the nearby stream. That night, we added the crackling campfire to the mix. At one point, my dad decided to head back to the house, about a quarter-mile away, to grab more beer and check on my grandma. Before he left, he told me not to mess with the fire. After a few minutes alone, things started to get eerily quiet. The wind died down, and the usual sounds of the woods, animals, bugs, even the stream, faded away. The silence was so unsettling. I've been left alone at the campsite plenty of times, but this time, I felt something was off. Then, out of nowhere, I started to taste something metallic at the back of my throat. It was a foul, bitter tang I couldn't explain. Just then, my dad returned, immediately angry. He accused me of throwing beer cans into the fire because he could smell burning metal on the trail. I denied it and even pointed to the empty cans sitting by the fire as proof. He brushed it off, saying a storm was coming, and told me we needed to head back to the house. As we started walking back, I noticed something strange about the lightning. When it flashed, it lit up the woods like it was daytime, but beyond the first few trees, everything was pitch black again. It was lightly raining, and the only other light came from the dim glow of the house windows. I was eating a slice of watermelon, as you do in August, when the first lightning flash hit. Everything was momentarily bright, and then the darkness swallowed it all back up. The next flash of lightning hit, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing just past the yard, across the stream, near the edge of the woods. It was a silhouette, but before I could really take it in, everything went dark again. As the next flash came, I noticed the figure had moved closer, now standing near the trees. I froze, unsure of what I was looking at or what to do. I didn't want to see it again, so I bolted inside the house. My grandma was doing dishes and asked why I'd come back in so fast. I told her I thought I saw something, and she immediately got my dad up, telling him to lock all the doors and windows. Despite being a little tipsy, he did as she asked without questioning it. That night, I slept with my grandma, and the next morning, we found the tent torn to shreds. The damage didn't look like it had been done by an animal, it was as if someone had yanked it apart. Around the same time, my uncle, who lived a mile or so up the road, had his entire chicken coop wiped out. All 8 chickens were dead, heads missing, but no blood. For the next few weeks, all the kids had to wait for the school bus with an adult present. My dad was late to work every day for almost 3 weeks. Any time I tried to talk about what happened, the subject got changed. I figured it was because I was a kid and no one took me seriously, but as I got older, I realized they were actively avoiding the conversation. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I truly understood what had happened. One Halloween, I was telling this story to some cousins, and my aunt suddenly got furious. She snapped at me, saying, "Don't you dare talk about that. Don't put that evil on them." It hit me then that my family wasn't just brushing it off, they were intentionally keeping it quiet. Later, when I started poking around online, I discovered that what I saw had a name. It was called the Goat Man, the same name my aunt had mentioned at that Halloween party. What still haunts me is that to this day, I can't describe any of the creature's features in detail, nor have I ever experienced that metallic, burning taste again. So, if you ever find yourself in the foothills of Kentucky, remember my grandma's rules: don't wander alone, don't answer if you hear your name, and if you think you see someone familiar out in the woods, no, you didn't, just go home. I had a close friend who loved hiking, we'll call her Annie to keep her identity private. She spent most of her free time on trails in the Appalachian region, especially in Tennessee and North Carolina. No matter the season, she was always out exploring the wilderness. One summer, she decided to tackle a large portion of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Springer Mountain, Georgia, and planning to finish at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. She didn't intend to hike the entire trail but had a solid route mapped out. I was all for it, and I even helped her prepare. We planned for me to meet her at Newfound Gap in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park when she passed through. I'd bring her some fresh supplies, and we'd hike together for a few days. As the day approached, I got her ready and drove her to the trailhead, leaving behind an excited and determined Annie. Over the next few weeks, I received postcards from her regularly. She stopped to pick up pre-arranged packages of food and supplies, and each card reassured me she was doing well and staying on schedule. When July arrived, we were getting close to the day we planned to meet at the Mount LeConte shelter. We'd settled on July 10th as our meeting date. She was supposed to send me a postcard from her last supply stop before we were due to meet, and sure enough, on July 2nd, I got one. She said she felt great and was right on schedule. I gathered all the supplies I'd need for our meetup, and my boyfriend at the time hiked with me to the shelter. We enjoyed the breathtaking views of the Smokies as we made our way up the steep climbs. By mid-afternoon, we reached the shelter, fully expecting Annie to be waiting for us. But when we checked at the front desk, we found out she hadn't arrived yet. At first, we weren't too concerned. Hiking schedules can be unpredictable, so we settled in and waited. As the sun set and darkness fell, my anxiety started to grow. We checked again at the office, but there was no sign of her. My boyfriend tried to calm me down, reassuring me that maybe she was just delayed. But by morning, when she still hadn't shown up, I was panicked. We hiked part of the trail in the direction she was supposed to come from, but there was no trace of her. Eventually, we had no choice but to leave the lodge and return home, leaving our contact info in case she showed up. Days passed, and there was still no word from her. Fear and guilt consumed me as the search efforts intensified. Search parties, police, and volunteers combed the area where she was last seen. Finally, nearly a week and a half later, they found her, bruised, starving, and hiding in a ravine about 30 miles off the Appalachian Trail. It was a terrifying relief to know she was alive. I was finally able to visit her in the hospital a day later, but Annie wasn't talking. She didn't tell the police what had happened, and it took her years before she finally opened up to me about the terrifying ordeal she endured. That experience made her give up hiking altogether. She hasn't gone back to the woods since. She shared her story with me eventually, and I want others to know that this kind of thing can happen. Here's what she told me, as best as I can remember it. Annie left the shelter early one morning, around 8 a.m., making great progress. It was late afternoon when she first heard something strange, men's voices coming from a distance. She assumed it was just other hikers and waited for them to pass by, but no one ever did. She brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just hearing things after being alone for so long. As night approached, she set up her tent and secured her food on the cables to keep it away from animals. While relaxing in her sleeping bag, she heard the voices again, louder this time. She could make out heavy Appalachian accents, but no one ever appeared. Uneasy, she eventually fell asleep. The next morning, she woke to find some of her food wrappers scattered around, though her backpack hadn't been damaged. She thought maybe squirrels had gotten into her things, but something didn't sit right with her. As she continued hiking, she tried to pick up the pace, but the unsettling feeling stayed with her. Hours later, the voices returned, always trailing behind her but never visible. No matter how much she looked back, she saw no one. That night, she decided to hike through the darkness, hoping to put distance between herself and whoever or whatever was following her. The voices eventually stopped, and she found a small clearing to rest for a bit. She hadn't even unpacked her tent when she heard them again, this time, much closer. "There she is," a deep voice said. She spun around, shining her flashlight on two filthy, ragged men standing a few feet away. Their clothes were torn, and they looked like they hadn't bathed in months. The way they stared at her made her skin crawl. She screamed and ran. They chased after her, barefoot, their feet crunching on the trail. Desperate, she cut off the trail and darted into the woods, losing them in the thick brush. For the next 2 weeks, Annie hid in the forest, barely surviving on the little food she had left. She could hear the men searching for her, sometimes catching glimpses of them through the trees. They talked about what they wanted to do to her, and she knew she was in real danger. Eventually, a park ranger and volunteers found her. After being rescued, she did some research and discovered that there are people, sometimes called wild men, who live in the mountains to avoid the law. Some of these people are dangerous criminals, hiding out after committing violent crimes. Since hearing Annie's story, I've been much more cautious about hiking. These wild men aren't just a myth, they're out there, and there's something you need to be aware of if you're deep in the mountains. Always be vigilant because you never know who might be lurking. To give you some background, I'm 23 years old and currently reside in New York City. However, my grandparents live in a very remote area of West Virginia, literally in the middle of nowhere. Their nearest neighbors are over an hour away in a tiny town with just a few houses and a Walmart. Last summer, my grandfather, whom I'll refer to as Robert for privacy, underwent hip surgery. Most of my family is located on the West Coast, and my grandmother, whom I'll call Muriel, is quite elderly and unable to care for Robert on her own. Since I was the closest relative, I was asked to come down and help for 2 weeks while he recovered. Fast forward a week into my stay, and everything was going smoothly. My main tasks involved assisting Robert with stairs and walking his blue heeler, Rocky. Normally, Robert would take Rocky for walks twice a day through the woods behind their property, but after the surgery, that responsibility fell to me. This was the part one dreaded most about helping him. I had always found those woods unsettling as a child. My cousins and I would get creeped out whenever we ventured into that forest. For the first week, walking Rocky at night was manageable, though a bit eerie. However, one evening, a week into my visit, while walking him through the woods around 8:30 p.m. with the sun setting over the Appalachian Mountains, I heard a strange whistle that sounded like it was about 20 yards away. Both Rocky and I froze, looking in the direction of the sound. I shined my flashlight, but there was nothing in sight, so I assumed it was just a bird. Looking back, though, I'm pretty sure it wasn't a bird. There are no nocturnal birds in that area that chirp like that, and the sound was too melodic. Rocky became visibly agitated, growling and staring into the darkness. He kept trying to back away until the whistling happened again. At that point, I decided it was time to leave, so I tugged on the leash and we both sprinted out of the woods and back home. When I told my grandparents about the experience, they seemed unnerved. My grandmother immediately asked if I had whistled back. I told her no, and she appeared relieved, insisting that I hadn't heard anything and encouraged me to ignore it. When I pressed her for more information, she refused to elaborate, which only left me feeling more anxious. The next morning, she suggested that instead of walking Rocky through the woods, I could just take him on laps around the house. So, for the remainder of my stay, I started doing just that, taking Rocky for about 50 laps around the house each evening. On the third to last night, while I was walking him as usual, I heard that same eerie whistle again, this time coming from behind the attached garage, which was only about 10 yards away. This time, I quickly took Rocky inside and locked all the doors. I spent the rest of the night with earbuds in, trying to block out any more whistling, just as my grandmother had advised. To this day, I have no idea what was whistling in those woods. Some friends suggested it might have been a skinwalker, but that's not a common legend around here. My girlfriend, who stayed back in New York City, consulted her Muslim parents, who are from Yemen, and they said that whistling at night is a sign that a jinn is nearby. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was made my grandparents genuinely fearful. I've heard about strange occurrences in Appalachia before, but this was my first personal encounter with something unsettling. Does anyone have any idea what could have caused that? If you ever find yourself in the mountains after dark, tread carefully, be respectful, and most importantly, never touch the skulls. When I first heard this warning, I thought it was just old mountain superstition. I had just moved to a small town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, looking for a quiet escape from the bustling city life I'd known. The idea of a house with a forest in the backyard and neighbors miles away seemed ideal. That's why I bought the property in the first place. The house itself was charming, even if it had its quirks, a creaky porch, a kitchen that felt cramped. The realtor kept calling it quaint, and despite its size, I agreed with her. But what really sold me was the acres of untouched forest that came with it. I remember my first trip into town, located at the base of the mountain. It was small, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. Some of the locals were a bit wary of me, but most were friendly, asking the usual questions about where I came from and what I did for work. Mr. Faraday, the owner of the town's only grocery store, asked if I planned on hiking the forest trails. Of course. I replied, probably with a laugh, as he packed up my groceries, watching me closely. Silly question, he said with a nod. The forest is safe enough during the day, but once the sun starts setting, you'd better be home. You don't want to mess with the wildlife, and it's easy to get lost after dark. Is there anything specific I should worry about? I asked. We get black bears sometimes. They'll usually run off if you make noise, but there are exceptions, like a mama with cubs. We've got foxes, wild boars, and even wolves. Wolves? I repeated, confused. I thought they were extinct around here. Mr. Faraday just shrugged and ignored the question, continuing, the important thing is to be respectful of the forest. Don't litter or take anything. If you see something strange, like bones or skulls, don't touch them. Walk around them. His words unsettled me, especially the part about the skulls, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just indulging in local folklore. I should have paid more attention. In the first few weeks, I hiked the trails in the late mornings, taking in the birds, small animals, and the wild beauty of the forest. I was careful to stay on the paths and brought water with me, following all the basic hiking rules. There was a spot where the trail split into two directions, but I never ventured past it, not wanting to get lost. As my work schedule shifted, I began hiking in the late afternoons, and that's when things started to change. The birds would stop singing earlier than usual, and I began noticing strange scratches on the trees, deep and long, as though something had clawed at them. I told myself it was probably just the changing season or animals preparing for winter. Then one evening, on my way back from a hike, I stumbled upon a deer skull lying right in the middle of the path. It looked old and bleached, out of place on the trail. I hadn't seen it on my way in. A chill crept up my spine as I looked around, but the forest was empty. Not wanting to leave the skull where I walked every day, I used a stick to move it off the path and continued home. That night, the howling started. It woke me up in the middle of the night, a long, haunting howl in the distance. I had never heard wolves in real life, and certainly not here. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to a lonely or injured animal, and eventually fell back asleep. Over the next few nights, the howling continued, growing louder and closer each time. I asked around town, but no one else seemed to have heard it. Mr. Faraday shook his head, pretending like nothing was wrong, while others just offered vague advice like keeping my doors locked. A few days later, while hiking, I found another skull, this time a moose. Its antlers were still attached, and it stared directly at me from the trail. I felt like someone, or something, was playing a cruel joke. I wanted to throw it away like the deer skull, but something in Mr. Faraday's warning stopped me. I walked around it instead and hurried back home. The night after that, I was jolted awake not by howling, but by the creak of my porch. Something heavy was moving out there, and when I heard a low growl right outside my window, I froze. The sound wasn't right, it was animalistic, but twisted, wrong. Then, a bone-rattling howl echoed outside, shaking the very walls of the house. I grabbed my phone and hid in the bathroom, the only room without windows. I stayed there all night, heart pounding, until the sun rose. When I finally dared to step outside, I found dozens of skulls arranged on my porch, some animal, some human. My stomach turned at the sight. I drove straight into town and confronted Mr. Faraday. He sighed, disappointed, and said, "I told you not to touch the bones, didn't I? Now you've stirred up trouble, not just for yourself, but for everyone." My blood ran cold. "Everyone?" I asked. "Everyone heard them last night because of you," he replied. "You made a mess, and now we all have to deal with it." I asked if leaving town would solve the problem, but he shook his head. "You can't run from this. You need to fix what you started." That night, a hunting party was organized at the diner. They handed me a shotgun and a crash course on how to use it. The bullets were supposedly blessed by the local priest, designed for dealing with whatever lurked in the woods. I'm writing this down because I don't know if I'll make it back. The locals call them the wolves of the Appalachians, but there's something far worse. If I don't return, at least someone will know what happened out here. The sun is setting now, and I can already hear them laughing in the distance.